The silence before truth. The night was quiet in Los Angeles. The streets outside Sandra Bullock's home were almost empty, and the sound of soft rain filled the air. She sat near the window, holding a small cup of tea, her mind drifting toward a face she had known for decades. Keanu Reeves, the man who rarely spoke about himself, who smiled kindly but carried storms behind his calm eyes. She had agreed to do a live interview that week. The world wanted her to talk about her career, her new film, her life after loss. But what she didn't tell anyone was that she had made a promise to reveal something she had held inside for years, something about Keanu that no one knew. The host had called her earlier, excited. "The audience loves stories about him," the voice said. "Everyone wants to know what kind of man he really is," Sandra smiled quietly. People saw his movies, his fame, his kindness, but they didn't see the man who disappeared after filming, the man who refused awards, or the one who quietly paid hospital bills for strangers. She had seen those parts. She had seen the parts the cameras never found. As she sipped her tea, her heart felt heavy. She remembered the first time she truly saw who he was, not the actor, but the man behind the silence. It was years ago, during the shooting of their first movie together. They were young, nervous, and still figuring out who they wanted to be. One morning, she arrived early on set and saw him sitting alone beside a crew member who was crying. Keanu wasn't saying much, just listening. The man's daughter was sick and he couldn't afford the treatment. Later that week, the child's bills were mysteriously paid in full. The father never found out who helped, but Sandra did. She had seen Keanu hand an envelope quietly to the production manager, whispering, "Don't tell him it was me." That day changed how she saw him forever. But there was something deeper, something that even she couldn't explain, a part of his life that was hidden beneath layers of pain and kindness. And that secret was the reason she had avoided interviews for years. In the following days, the interview date drew closer. Headlines started popping up everywhere. Sandra Bullock to reveal shocking truth about Keanu Reeves. Fans were curious, some even angry. Others believed she was doing it for attention, but Sandra stayed silent. She wasn't chasing attention. She was keeping a promise she made to him years ago, on a night that neither of them would ever forget. It was the night Keanu had almost lost everything. The memory came back like a wave. A stormy evening. Keanu calling her unexpectedly, his voice trembling. He never called for help, not even when he needed it. But that night, something was different. She had rushed to his house. When she got there, he was sitting on the floor beside a candle, holding an old photograph. She had never seen him look so broken. He didn't say much, just whispered, "I'm fine, Sandy. I just didn't want to be alone tonight." She stayed with him until morning. She didn't ask questions. She just sat there beside him until the first light touched the window. Years passed, but she never forgot that night. She knew there was more behind his silence, more behind the way he helped people, always from the shadows. Now, as she prepared for the interview, Sandra looked at an old box beside her. Inside was something Keanu had given her long ago, something he told her never to show until she felt the time was right. It was a small notebook, brown leather, slightly torn, and on the first page in Keanu's handwriting were the words, "To remember kindness when the world forgets." Her eyes filled with tears as she opened it. Inside were names, dozens of them. Strangers, workers, neighbors, people she had never met. Beside each name was a note. Paid rent, bought medicine, sent books, left food at door. She realized then that the world had no idea who Keanu truly was. He wasn't just kind. He was quietly saving people, one act at a time. But the notebook also held a secret at the end, a message she wasn't ready to face until now. The words read, "If someday the truth about me hurts, tell them why I did it." Her breath caught. Tell them why I did it. She knew what that meant. She knew the truth he had hidden all along. And she knew that once she revealed it, nothing would ever be the same again. That night, the rain kept falling. Sandra closed the notebook and whispered softly, "It's time." The world thought it was just another interview. They didn't know it would become a confession, one that would change how millions saw the man they thought they already knew. And when the lights would go on and the cameras would roll, Sandra Bullock would finally speak the truth about Keanu Reeves's private life, one that wasn't about fame or secrets, but about a love so pure and pain so deep that it reshaped everything she believed about kindness and strength. The next morning, a single headline began to spread across social media. Sandra Bullock breaks silence. World waits to hear what she has to say about Keanu Reeves. And in her quiet home, holding that notebook close to her heart, she whispered to herself, "You wanted them to know, Keanu, so they will." But deep down, she didn't realize that her revelation would not only uncover his hidden life, it would expose her own secret, one that she had buried just as deeply. And when that secret came out, the world would stop breathing for a moment. The story had just begun. The interview begins. The morning of the interview arrived with a strange stillness in the air. Sandra Bullock woke up before sunrise, her heart beating faster than usual. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, staring at the window as soft light entered her room. The world outside looked calm, but inside her, a storm was quietly rising. She knew that once she spoke, once her words reached millions, there would be no going back. Keanu had always been a private man. He never liked attention, never liked praise. And what she was about to say would pull him into a light he never asked for. Still, she whispered to herself, he asked me to tell them why. The studio was already buzzing when she arrived. Lights were being set up, microphones checked, and producers hurried around with nervous excitement. The host, Michael, greeted her warmly. "You look beautiful as always," he said, "but you seem a bit tense. Everything okay?" She forced a smile. "Just a long night," she replied softly. What she didn't tell him was that she had barely slept. She had read every page of Keanu's notebook again and again until her tears blurred the ink. Each name was a story, a small world that he had changed without ever asking for thanks. But one name, written at the very end, had broken her completely. The name was Julia. And beside it, Keanu had written only 2 words, "My promise." She didn't know who Julia was, not back then. But the way the words were written, firm, slightly darker than the others, told her it meant something deep, something painful. The camera crew called her to the chair. She sat down, trying to breathe slowly. The lights were warm against her skin. Behind the cameras, an audience had gathered. Some were fans, others journalists. Everyone was waiting. Michael began the show with a cheerful tone. "Today we're joined by the incredible Sandra Bullock," he said, his voice full of charm. "She's here to talk about her life, her new projects, and—" He paused, smiling. "A certain man everyone's curious about." The crowd chuckled. Sandra smiled faintly. "So," Michael continued, leaning forward, "you've known Keanu Reeves for a long time. You've worked together, stayed friends, supported each other through so much. People say you share something special. What makes him different?" Sandra looked at him for a moment, then at the camera. Her fingers trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "He listens," she said quietly. "He listens even when no one else does. He sees people that the world forgets. He's not just kind, he's deeply human." The audience went silent. She could feel every eye on her, waiting for more. Michael leaned closer. "You mentioned before that you had something important to share about him. Something people don't know." Sandra hesitated. She thought about stopping, about changing the subject. But then she remembered Keanu's voice from years ago, calm, soft, filled with quiet honesty. "If someday the truth about me hurts," he had said, "tell them why I did it." She looked down for a moment, then lifted her eyes again. "There's something I found after his sister passed away," she began slowly. "Something he asked me to keep safe." Michael nodded gently, sensing the emotion in her tone. "You mean his notebook?" She froze for a second. No one was supposed to know about the notebook. She had never mentioned it publicly. Her heart raced. "How do you know about that?" she asked softly. Michael cleared his throat, looking uneasy. "We received a message this morning," he said carefully. It was left at the studio front desk. No name. Just an envelope that said, "For Sandra." He handed it to her on live television. The envelope was old, slightly worn, and her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a folded note. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Keanu's. The note said, "If you're reading this, you're keeping your promise. Don't be afraid."
They deserve to know about Julia.
A quiet gasp spread through the studio. The audience could feel something heavy unfolding. Michael spoke softly.
Who is Julia?
Sandra's throat tightened. She stared at the letter for a long moment before whispering, "She was someone he loved and lost." The words hung in the air like smoke. "Julia was an artist," she continued slowly. "She was kind, creative, and gentle. She loved painting sunrises. Keanu met her years ago, long before most people knew his name. They fell in love, but their story never made the news. He kept it private, just like everything else." The audience listened in silence. Some leaned forward, others held their breath. "She got sick," Sandra said, her voice trembling. "He took care of her quietly without telling anyone. The world never saw him in hospitals or interviews because he was there, sitting beside her every day. He cooked for her, read to her, held her hand through the worst nights." A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it quickly and tried to steady her voice. "And when she passed away," she whispered, "he promised to keep helping people like her. Quietly, without names, without cameras. That's what the notebook is. It's not a list of donations or fame. It's his way of keeping her alive through kindness." The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights. Michael looked at her, speechless for once. Finally, he asked, "Did he ever talk about her with you?" Sandra nodded. "Only once. He said, 'She taught me that love doesn't end when someone's gone. It just finds new ways to exist.'" The audience's eyes glistened. Even the crew members behind the cameras looked emotional.
"He never wanted anyone to know,"
Sandra continued softly. "But I think the world needs to understand what drives a man like him. People think his sadness makes him distant, but it's not that. It's compassion. It's the weight of feeling too much in a world that feels too little." She paused, taking a deep breath. "And that's what I wanted to share today. Not a scandal, not gossip, but the truth about his heart." Michael nodded slowly. "That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that." But as the interview seemed to move toward its end, a sudden alert flashed on the screen behind them. The crew whispered to one another. The director gestured urgently. Michael looked confused. We're getting something from the news desk," he said uncertainly.
"Is this real?"
The screen flickered and showed a breaking news banner. Citing: "Keanu Reeves visits small-town hospice in Northern California. Anonymous donations linked to unknown fund." Sandra froze. The note in her hand trembled. Michael turned to her slowly.
"Sandra, did you know about this?"
She shook her head, her heart pounding. "No, but I think he wanted us to find him." The studio filled with whispers. Reporters began typing. Fans online started flooding the live comments. And in that moment, the interview that was meant to end quietly turned into something far bigger. Sandra knew what she had to do next. She looked into the camera, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "Keanu, if you're watching this, I'm coming." And with that, she stood up and walked off the stage, leaving the entire world in suspense. The host sat frozen. The camera stayed on her empty chair. The internet exploded within minutes. But for Sandra, none of that mattered anymore. She had one thought echoing in her heart: find him before he disappears again. The road to silence. The sun was setting when Sandra Bullock left the studio. Flashes from cameras burst like lightning behind her, but she didn't turn around. Her eyes were fixed ahead, her steps quick, her heart heavy. Reporters called her name, asking what the revelation meant, where Keanu was, and why she had left the interview so suddenly. She didn't answer. She slid into the back seat of a black car, shut the door, and whispered to the driver, "Please, just drive." As the car moved through Los Angeles traffic, her phone buzzed nonstop. Her manager, her friends, journalists, and even fans were calling. She ignored them all. Her hands were still shaking from holding that note, the one Keanu had left for her at the studio. "Don't be afraid." They deserved to know about Julia, but what scared her wasn't the note. It was the feeling that Keanu had planned this moment. It was as if he knew she would finally speak, as if he had been waiting for her to do it. And now he was somewhere far away, doing something again that no one understood. The driver glanced at her through the mirror. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She nodded weakly. "Yes, thank you. Can you take me to Burbank Airport?" "Burbank? Tonight?" "Yes. I need a flight to Northern California." He nodded quietly. As the car sped up, she looked out at the city lights blurring past. She thought of all the times she and Keanu had spoken about peace, about pain, about how to keep going when the world feels too heavy. She remembered one conversation clearly. They had been sitting on a film set late at night, both tired but smiling. He had told her softly, "People think healing is loud, but sometimes it's just doing small good things in silence, one person at a time." That was Keanu. Always gentle, always quiet, always hiding behind humility. But something inside her said, this time was different. The news report mentioned a hospice, and she remembered that the last time she had seen him cry was in a hospital, too. As the plane took off, Sandra closed her eyes and held the notebook close to her chest. She whispered, "Please be safe." Hours later, the plane landed in a small town near Monterey. The air was colder, cleaner, and strangely still. She rented a small car and followed the directions to the hospice mentioned in the news. It was late evening, and the sky was a soft orange fading into deep blue. The hospice stood on a hill overlooking the ocean. It looked peaceful, too peaceful for what she felt inside. When she entered the reception area, an elderly nurse greeted her kindly. "Good evening. How can I help you?" Sandra hesitated. "I'm looking for someone. I think he visited here today. His name is Keanu Reeves." The nurse blinked, surprised. "Oh, you mean the quiet man who brought the books and food?" "Yes," Sandra said quickly. "Is he still here?" The nurse smiled gently. "He left an hour ago. He didn't want to disturb anyone." "Did he say where he was going?" The nurse thought for a moment. "He asked about the small church by the cliffs. Said he wanted to sit there for a while." Sandra thanked her and hurried outside. The wind had picked up. She drove toward the cliffs, the sound of waves growing louder as she got closer. The small church stood alone at the edge of the hill, lit by a few candles through stained glass windows. She parked the car and stepped out. Inside, the air was cool and quiet. Wooden benches creaked softly under her feet, and then she saw him. Keanu was sitting in the front row, head slightly bowed, his hands folded. He looked thinner, quieter, but still calm. She stood there for a moment, watching him. He didn't turn around, but somehow, he spoke as if he already knew she was there. "You shouldn't have come all this way," he said softly. Her voice trembled. "You left me no choice." He turned slowly, and when she saw his face, her heart broke. His eyes were tired but peaceful. "You told them," he said with a small smile. "I saw the clip online. You did well. Why didn't you tell me you were here?" she whispered. "Because I didn't want you to worry." "Keanu," she said, stepping closer. "You sent that note. You planned all this." He smiled faintly. "Not planned, just hoped." "Hoped for what?" "For peace." She sat beside him. "Peace from what?" He looked at the candles flickering at the altar. "From the noise. From the constant pretending that everything is fine." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the ocean outside filled the silence between them. Then he reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small, folded photograph. It was old and slightly faded. She opened it slowly and gasped. It was Julia, the same woman from the notebook. But she wasn't alone in the picture. Beside her was a little girl. Sandra's hands shook. "Keanu, who is she?" He looked down, his voice breaking slightly. "Her name is Anna, Julia's daughter." "Her daughter?" Sandra whispered. "I thought Julia—" "She passed before Anna was born," he said softly. "But before she died, she told me she was expecting. I didn't find out until later. Anna was born in a small-town hospital. She's been growing up quietly, away from the world. I've been taking care of her from a distance, paying for her school, her home, everything. She doesn't know who I am." Sandra covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes. "Oh my God, Keanu! Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because she deserves a life without my shadow," he said quietly. "No fame, no attention, no headlines. I visit sometimes when she's at school. I fix her bike, leave gifts at her door. She thinks it's from a neighbor." Sandra couldn't stop crying. You've been living with this secret all these years? He nodded slowly. Julia asked me one thing before she died: to protect Anna and never let the world take her innocence. So I did. But she's growing up now, and soon I'll have to tell her. He looked at Sandra with tired eyes. That's why I wanted you to speak. Not to reveal my kindness, but to remind people that silence can have meaning. I wanted the world to stop seeing fame as light and see that sometimes kindness hides in darkness. Sandra took his hand. You're still carrying too much alone. He smiled sadly. We all carry something, Sandy. I just choose to carry mine quietly. She leaned closer. Where is Anna now? He pointed toward the window. Outside, through the glass, Sandra saw a young girl playing with a volunteer near the garden. She had long, dark hair, a gentle smile, and the same calm eyes as Keanu. She comes here sometimes, he whispered. Her foster family visits patients. She loves painting, just like her mother. Sandra watched the child, tears streaming down her face. She's beautiful. Keanu nodded. She's my reminder that love never truly ends. They sat there together in silence, watching the little girl through the window. The waves crashed softly in the distance, and the candles flickered gently. After a while, Sandra whispered, Keanu, the world will want to know. They'll dig, they'll ask, they'll twist everything. He sighed softly. Then let them. Maybe they'll learn something about love, too. The church bells rang faintly as the last light of day disappeared behind the ocean. Sandra realized that this wasn't just about a secret anymore. It was about legacy, about how kindness travels from one soul to another, and for the first time in years, Keanu smiled. A real smile, warm and full of quiet peace. Thank you for keeping your promise, he said gently. She held his hand tighter. We're not done yet. He looked at her curiously. What do you mean? You wanted people to know why you did it, she said softly. But they still don't know everything. There's one more truth left. He frowned slightly. What truth? Sandra looked at the notebook in her bag. The one about you and me. His eyes widened just a little, and for the first time that evening his calm broke. The waves crashed harder outside. The candles flickered more wildly. Something unspoken hung in the air, and deep inside both their hearts. They knew that the next truth would be the one that changed everything. The truth between them. The night grew colder as the waves crashed harder against the cliffs. The small church by the ocean now glowed faintly under the moonlight. Sandra and Keanu sat in silence, both lost in the sound of the sea and the unspoken words that hung between them. Sandra could feel her heart beating faster. She had carried this truth for years, buried deep under smiles, interviews, and movie scripts. But now, sitting beside him, watching his eyes flicker in the candlelight, she knew it was time. Keanu turned to her gently. What did you mean? The truth about you and me? Sandra looked down for a moment, trying to steady her voice. You remember the night after Julia's funeral? His expression changed. He nodded slowly. How could I forget? You were broken, she whispered. You didn't speak for hours. I stayed because I didn't want you to be alone. He looked at her softly. You saved me that night. She shook her head. No, Keanu. I didn't save you. I just sat beside you. But something happened that night. Something we both never spoke about. He frowned slightly, his eyes searching hers. What do you mean? Sandra took a deep breath. A few weeks after that night, I found out I was pregnant. The sound of the ocean seemed to vanish. Keanu froze completely. She looked at him with trembling hands. I didn't tell you. I didn't tell anyone. I was scared. You were still grieving Julia, and I couldn't bring myself to add to your pain. His voice barely came out. Pregnant? Yes, she whispered. But I lost the baby before I could even think of what to do. I went through it quietly. I didn't want the world to know. I didn't want you to carry another sorrow. Keanu sat back, his eyes wide and full of shock. He ran his hand through his hair, breathing heavily. Sandy, he whispered, you went through that alone? She nodded slowly. I thought it was the right thing. You had already lost so much. I didn't want to become another reason for your pain. For a long moment, he said nothing, His eyes were full of tears he didn't try to hide. He looked out the window at the dark ocean, his face pale, his voice trembling. "And all this time," he said quietly, "I thought I had already lost everything. But I never knew I lost something. I never got to meet." Sandra reached for his hand and he held hers tightly. The silence between them was full of everything they had never said. "That's why I understood you," she whispered. "Why I defended you when people didn't understand your silence. Because I carried the same silence." Keanu closed his eyes. "You shouldn't have carried it alone. And you shouldn't have either," she said softly. The candles flickered, casting a warm light around them. For the first time in years, the two of them weren't actors or celebrities. They were just two broken souls who had quietly carried each other through pain without ever saying it aloud. After a while, Keanu stood and walked toward the altar. He lit another candle and whispered something under his breath. Sandra followed him quietly. "What did you say?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly. "A thank you. For her, for Julia, for you." Sandra's eyes glistened. "What did you thank me for?" "For keeping the promise I didn't even know you made," he said. She stepped closer. "And what promise is that?" He turned to her slowly. "The promise that love doesn't always need to be spoken to be real." She looked down, her throat tightening. "Keanu, do you ever wish things had been different?" He smiled sadly. "Sometimes. But then I remember maybe things were meant to be this way. Maybe our purpose wasn't to have everything, but to keep reminding each other that kindness still matters." She nodded, tears falling silently. "You're still that same man, Keanu. You've never changed?" "No," he said softly. "I just learned how to live with the things I can't fix." They stood there together for a long time, listening to the ocean and the wind. There was peace in the stillness, but also something unfinished, something waiting to be said. Finally, Sandra spoke again. "There's one more thing I need to show you." She reached into her bag and pulled out the notebook. Keanu's eyes widened slightly. "You still have it?" he said. "Of course I do," she replied softly. "I kept it safe all these years, but I didn't tell you that there's something written in the back that you never showed me." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She opened the notebook and turned to the last page. Under the list of names and the word "my promise," there was one more message written in small letters, one he had forgotten about. She read it aloud quietly. "If life gives me one more chance to make peace, I'll start with the people I love but never told." Keanu looked down, his lips trembling. "I wrote that the night Julia died, and you never got the chance to finish it," she said softly. He nodded slowly. "No, I didn't." She looked up at him, her eyes full of tears. "Then finish it now." He stared at her for a moment, breathing deeply. "You want me to say it?" She nodded. He stepped closer, his voice quiet but steady. "I loved you, Sandy. Maybe in a way that never fit the world we lived in. I loved you for your strength, your laughter, your patience when I couldn't speak. I thought if I stayed silent, I'd protect what we had. But silence doesn't protect. It just hides what needs to be felt." Her tears fell freely now. She reached up and touched his face gently. "And I loved you too," she whispered, "even when I told myself I shouldn't." He closed his eyes, pressing her hand against his cheek. "Then maybe we can stop pretending now." The wind outside howled through the cracks of the church, and the candles swayed. For a brief moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. Sandra leaned her head on his shoulder. "What happens now?" Keanu sighed softly. "We do what we've always done. We help people quietly. We live with kindness. But maybe this time, we do it together." She smiled faintly through her tears. "Together." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in the silence that no longer hurt. But just as peace began to settle, the sound of footsteps echoed from the church door. Sandra turned, startled. A young volunteer entered, holding a small envelope. "Mr. Reeves?" she said gently. "This just arrived for you." Someone left it outside. Keanu took the envelope carefully. It had no name, no address, just a single word written on the front. "Anna." His heart stopped. He opened it slowly. Inside was a drawing of the ocean and two candles side by side. Beneath it, Written in a child's handwriting were the words, "Thank you for fixing my bike, Mr. Kind Man." Sandra gasped softly. She knows. Keanu stared at the letter, his hands trembling. She found out, and for the first time a mix of fear and hope filled his eyes. "What now?" Sandra whispered. He looked out toward the sea. "Now," he said quietly, "the past is finding us." The letter that broke the silence. The candlelight in the old church flickered as Keanu stared at the small envelope. The simple word written on it, Anna, seemed to echo louder than the crashing waves outside. Sandra stood beside him, frozen, watching the quiet shock spread across his face. For years, he had protected Anna from his past, from the cameras, from the world that had taken too much from him already. But now, that world had somehow found its way back to him, through the soft handwriting of a little girl who had unknowingly reached his heart again. Sandra spoke softly, afraid to break the fragile air between them. "Keanu, she knows, doesn't she?" He didn't answer. He just kept looking at the note, his thumb brushing across the words. Finally, he whispered, "It's her handwriting. She used to draw suns and waves like this when she was younger. She used to leave them on the hospice garden bench." He sat down slowly, his body trembling slightly. "She knows I'm the man who's been helping her all these years. Somehow she found out." Sandra knelt beside him. "Maybe it's time she did." He looked at her, eyes filled with both pain and relief. "You don't understand. She's safe because she doesn't know. If the world connects her to me, she loses her peace." Sandra reached for his hand. "She's not a secret, Keanu. She's a person. And maybe she doesn't want to be protected anymore. Maybe she wants to know the truth." He closed his eyes. "Truth doesn't always heal, Sandy. Sometimes it just reopens old wounds. Or," she said gently, "it sets you free." He sighed deeply. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall against the glass. The young volunteer who had delivered the letter peeked back through the door. "Sir, there's more," she said softly, holding out a small brown envelope. "Someone left this too. It has your name." Keanu hesitated, then took it. He opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a tiny seashell taped to the corner. His hands shook as he unfolded it. The note read, "Dear Mr. Kind Man, I saw your face on TV. Miss Bullock said you help people when nobody's watching. I think you're my friend from the garden. Mom says you look like my father's old friend. Are you?" His breath caught. Sandra's eyes filled with tears as she read over his shoulder. "If you are, I'm not mad. I just wanted to say thank you for never forgetting me. I still paint like Mom did. Maybe one day we can paint the ocean together. From Anna." The last line was a small drawing of two stick figures, one tall, one small, painting side by side under a yellow sun. Keanu pressed the letter to his chest, his voice breaking. "She knows. She really knows." Sandra's voice trembled. "Keanu? She's reaching out. She doesn't want money or fame. She wants you." He sat there quietly, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know if I deserve that." She put a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe it's not about deserving anymore. Maybe it's just about showing up." For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain grew heavier, tapping against the old church roof like soft whispers from the past. Then suddenly, Keanu stood up. "I have to see her." Sandra looked at him in surprise. "Now?" He nodded. "She found me. The least I can do is let her see who I am before the world tells her." Sandra grabbed her coat. "Then I'm coming with you." He hesitated. "Sandy, this could get complicated. There'll be cameras soon. People will twist everything." She smiled softly. "Let them. This isn't for them. This is for her." They left the church together, the sound of rain following them as they drove down the narrow road toward the hospice garden. By the time they arrived, The rain had softened into a gentle drizzle. The lights from the small building glowed warmly in the mist. Inside, Anna was sitting by a window, holding a sketchbook. A nurse stood beside her. The little girl turned when the door opened, her eyes widening. Keanu froze for a moment, unable to move. She had grown taller, but her eyes, gentle, curious, and kind, were the same as Julia's. She blinked, surprised. "You're the man from the garden," she said softly. Keanu knelt down, his voice trembling. "Yes, I am." She tilted her head, studying him. "You're Keanu Reeves," he smiled faintly. "That's what people call me." "So, you're really the one who fixes my bike?" she asked. He nodded. "I am." "And the one who leaves the paint sets at my door?" "Yes." "And the one who sends the birthday cards with stars drawn on them?" He smiled again. "That's me." Anna smiled shyly. "I knew it." Sandra stood by the doorway, tears silently falling as she watched them. Keanu took a deep breath. "Anna," he said softly, "there's something you should know about me, about your mother." She looked up, curious but calm. "Mom told me once that someone kind helped her when she was sick. She said if I ever met him, I should thank him for giving her hope." Keanu's voice cracked. "That was me." Anna's eyes softened. "I knew it." She reached out and gently held his hand. "You don't have to say sorry. Mom used to tell me that good people don't need to explain. They just show up when it matters." He couldn't hold it in anymore. Tears streamed down his face. "I've missed so much of your life." She squeezed his hand. "Then don't miss what's next." Sandra stepped forward and knelt beside them. "Anna, your mom would be proud of both of you." The little girl smiled at her. "You're Sandra Bullock, right? I saw you on TV with him." Sandra chuckled softly. "Yes, I am." "You're very kind," Anna said. "Mom used to say kindness finds kindness." Keanu looked at Sandra then, their eyes meeting through tears. For a moment, everything around them disappeared. The cameras, the headlines, the pain. There was only this small circle of truth and love, alive again after years of silence. The nurse approached quietly. "It's late," she said gently. "Anna needs rest." Anna nodded and hugged Keanu suddenly. He froze for a moment, then wrapped his arms around her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not letting go." He closed his eyes. "I never will." As she left with the nurse, Keanu stayed on his knees, shaking quietly. Sandra placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. "You finally faced her." He wiped his tears, his voice low. "I don't know what comes next." "You don't have to," she said softly. "Just don't disappear again." He looked at her. "I won't. Not this time." They walked outside together into the rain. The sky was beginning to clear, a pale light breaking through the clouds. For the first time in years, Keanu felt lighter. But as they reached the car, a flash of light startled them. Not from the sky, but from behind the trees. A camera. Another. Voices. Reporters. Sandra froze. "They found us." Keanu clenched his jaw. "They'll ruin this. They'll twist everything." He turned to her quickly. "You have to get Anna out of here. I'll stay." "No," she said firmly. "We face this together." He looked at her with quiet gratitude. "Always the brave one." She smiled softly. "And you're always the kind one." As the reporters rushed forward, shouting questions, Keanu took a step ahead, shielding Sandra. The flashes surrounded them, the air filled with noise and chaos. But beneath the storm of voices, Sandra reached for his hand and whispered something only he could hear. "Don't let them steal the peace we just found." He nodded. And with that, Keanu did something he had never done before. He turned to the cameras, his eyes calm but strong, and said softly, You want the truth? It's simple. Love doesn't need to be seen to be real. The crowd fell silent for a moment, unsure how to react. But somewhere in that crowd, a small voice, Anna's, whispered from behind the nurse, "That's my dad." The flashes went wild again, and just like that, the world finally knew. The world finally listened the next morning. The world woke to headlines that filled every screen. Every phone, every corner of the internet. Keanu Reeves, secret life revealed. Actor's hidden kindness story melts hearts worldwide. Sandra Bullock stands beside Keanu in emotional moment caught on camera. The little girl named Anna. The reason behind his years of quiet generosity. For once, the news wasn't cruel. It wasn't about gossip or scandal. It was about something rare. Pure, quiet kindness. Sandra sat in the small hotel room by the coast, her hair still damp from the rain. She scrolled through the endless stories online. Millions of people were sharing messages about kindness, forgiveness, and love. There were photos of the moment Keanu had faced the reporters, holding Sandra's hand as Anna stood behind them. There was no anger in his eyes, only calm strength. A gentle knock came at the door. When she opened it, Keanu stood there, tired, quiet, but peaceful. "They're waiting for you downstairs," he said softly. "Reporters, fans, even the mayor," she smiled faintly. "And you?" He shrugged lightly. "I'm just here to make sure you eat breakfast." She laughed quietly, but her eyes were red. "How are you holding up?" "I've had better nights," he said, walking in. "But I've also had worse." She handed him a cup of coffee. They sat together by the window, watching the ocean waves below. For a while, they didn't talk. Then Sandra broke the silence. "You know, the world finally sees who you really are," she said softly. He shook his head. "They see what you showed them, not who I am. I just tried to do the right thing." "But that's who you are," she said. "You help people quietly. You live for others, and now people are learning from it." He looked out the window. "It's strange. I spent years running from attention, and now the truth is everywhere. But maybe it's okay. Maybe this time it's for the right reason." "It is," she said. They watched the waves for a moment longer before he turned to her. "Anna asked for you," he said. "She wants to see you before we go." Sandra nodded and followed him to the hospice garden. Anna was sitting on the grass, painting with soft strokes. When she saw them, she smiled brightly. "Look," she said, holding up the canvas. It showed 3 figures, 2 adults and 1 child, standing together by the ocean. The sun was rising behind them. Above their heads, she had painted words in small letters. "Love never hides." Sandra knelt beside her. "That's beautiful, Anna," the girl smiled. "It's for you both, because you taught me that love doesn't need to be loud to be strong." Keanu crouched beside her, his voice soft. "Your mother would be proud of you." Anna nodded. "I hope so." "I think she's watching." They stayed with her for a while, helping her mix colors and talk about art. The peace of the moment was gentle, almost sacred. But as the afternoon light began to fade, Keanu's phone buzzed. His manager was calling again. "You need to address the press," the voice said urgently. "They want a statement before things get out of control." Keanu looked at Sandra. She nodded silently. It was time. A few hours later, they stood on a small stage outside the hospice. Hundreds of people had gathered. Fans, journalists, locals, and strangers who just wanted to see the man whose kindness had touched the world. Keanu stepped up to the microphone. Sandra stood quietly beside him, her hand resting gently on Anna's shoulder. He looked around at the crowd. His voice was calm but full of emotion. "For many years," he began, "I tried to keep my life private. Not because I wanted to hide, but because I wanted to protect the small moments that make life meaningful." He paused. "I've seen loss. I've seen pain. But I've also seen how kindness, even a small act, can change everything. Sometimes it's not about grand gestures or big words. It's about the quiet choices we make when no one is watching." The crowd listened in silence. He looked down at Anna, who smiled back. "This little girl reminded me that love doesn't end when people leave. It continues through the things we do, through the hearts we touch. His voice grew softer. If my story means anything, let it mean this. Don't wait to be perfect before you're kind. Don't wait for the world to notice before you do good. Just start. One person, one small act, one quiet moment at a time. The audience was completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Sandra stepped forward then, taking the microphone gently. What you saw in that notebook, what you read in the news, that wasn't charity. That was love. Keanu has always believed that every person, no matter who they are, deserves to feel seen. She smiled faintly, tears glimmering in her eyes. And I think the world needed to see that too. The crowd began to applaud softly. Not the loud kind of applause, but the kind that comes from deep respect. Some people wiped their tears. Others simply stood still, as if afraid to break the moment. Keanu turned to Sandra, their eyes meeting. For a long time, no words were needed. They had both carried silence for years. Now, it had finally found its voice. As they stepped down from the stage, a small group of volunteers approached with a proposal. "We want to start something," one of them said. "A kindness fund, in your names, to help children and families in need, inspired by what you did." Keanu smiled quietly. "Don't use our names. Call it something simple." Sandra thought for a moment. "Call it the Everyday Kindness Project." And that's how it began, a small movement born not from fame, but from love. Within days, donations came from all over the world. Letters poured in from strangers, saying they had helped someone because of the story. I left food for a neighbor. I paid a student's rent. I listened to someone who just needed to be heard. Kindness was spreading, quietly, beautifully, endlessly. Weeks later, when the world had moved on to its next story, Sandra and Keanu returned to the same church by the cliffs. It was calm again, just as it had been the night everything began. They lit 2 candles, one for Julia, one for the child they both had lost years ago. Sandra whispered softly, "Do you think they're proud of us?" Keanu smiled gently. "I think they're smiling. Wherever they are." The wind outside carried the scent of the sea through the open door. He turned to her and said quietly, "Thank you." "For what?" she asked. "For seeing me when the world only saw an actor." She smiled through her tears. "And thank you for reminding me that love isn't always about who stays. Sometimes it's about who never stops caring." They stood together in silence, their hands intertwined. No cameras, no lights, no noise, just 2 souls who had finally found peace. And as they left the church, the last candle flickered in the wind, a single flame burning for every quiet act of kindness still waiting to be done.